My wife looked at me and said, "You've become a burden in this house." My friends would have argued. My lawyer would have fought. But I calmly agreed and stepped back. She didn't realize what would happen next when everything I'd done disappeared. My name is Calder Harris, and I'm 66 years old. This morning I'm sitting by the window in my living room with a cup of black coffee warming my hands, while a soft rain drifts across the quiet street outside. The world feels slow at this hour, the kind of quiet that invites a man to think. At my age, you begin to look back on certain moments differently. Not with anger or regret, but with a kind of calm understanding that only comes after time has done its work. Some memories stay with you, not because they were loud, but because they quietly change the way you see everything. I'm telling this story now because there was a moment in my life when a single sentence changed the direction of my marriage. What followed was not a fight, not a dramatic ending, but something quieter, and in many ways more important. Sometimes it takes one small boundary set calmly and without bitterness to reveal truths that have been hiding in plain sight for years. And once that line is drawn, life has a way of showing everyone exactly where they stand. When I look back on those years with Caroline, the first word that comes to mind is steady. Our life was not dramatic or exciting in the way some people describe marriage, but it had a rhythm that felt dependable. We had been together long enough that most days passed quietly, without either of us needing to explain much to the other. We lived in a small town tucked between low hills and long stretches of open highway. It was the kind of place where the grocery store clerk remembered your name, and where people waved from their porches in the evening. Life there moved slowly, and for many years I believed that pace suited us perfectly. Most mornings began the same way. I would wake before sunrise, walk into the kitchen, and start a pot of coffee while the house was still quiet. The light through the window usually came in soft and pale, especially during the colder months when the mornings lingered in gray. Caroline rarely woke as early as I did. Her work often kept her up late answering messages or reviewing reports from the office. I understood that, so I tried to keep the mornings peaceful. By the time she came downstairs, the coffee would already be ready. I would slide a mug across the counter to her, and she would give me a quick smile while checking the first messages of the day on her phone. Our conversations in those moments were simple. We talked about the weather, about what needed fixing around the house, or about her meetings scheduled for later that morning. It felt ordinary, the kind of ordinary that slowly builds a life over decades. After breakfast, I usually stepped outside to check the yard. The fence along the back line of the property needed attention now and then, and the small vegetable garden I kept behind the garage had become a quiet hobby of mine over the years. I liked working with my hands. Fixing things gave me a sense of order that I had always valued. Inside the house, there was always something small to maintain. A loose cabinet hinge, a filter that needed replacing, a door that stuck when the humidity changed. None of it was complicated, but those little tasks kept the house running the way it should. Caroline's world was very different. Her days were filled with conference calls, deadlines, and people who seemed to expect answers immediately. Even in the evenings, the work sometimes followed her home. I would hear the quiet murmur of her voice from the office down the hallway, while she spoke to colleagues in different time zones. I never saw that as a problem. In fact, I admired the way she handled the pressure. When she finally came out to the living room at night, she often looked tired but satisfied the way someone does after finishing something important. I would usually already have dinner ready, or be finishing the last few dishes. We would sit together for a while afterward, sometimes watching an old movie or simply listening to the quiet of the house settling for the night. From the outside, I imagine our marriage looked comfortable. Friends who visited often commented on how calm our home felt. They noticed the garden in the back, the tidy kitchen, the old wooden table we had kept since our early years together. People assumed we had figured things out. In some ways, maybe we had. Caroline was ambitious, and I supported that without hesitation. When her schedule grew heavier, I adjusted my own routines so the house would remain easy for her to return to at the end of the day. If a repair needed doing, I handled it. If groceries needed picking up, I stopped by the store on my way home. It felt natural to me. Marriage, at least the way I understood it, meant carrying the parts of life that made things easier for the person beside you. Looking back now, I can see that those years contained a kind of balance. But it was not a balance that had ever been clearly spoken. It was simply a pattern we had fallen into over time, one that worked quietly in the background of our lives. At the time, I believed that was enough. The change began quietly, the way most important changes do. Caroline's promotion came in the middle of a busy week. She walked through the front door that evening, with a kind of energy I had not seen in a long time, her phone still in her hand, and a smile that seemed both proud and relieved. She told me the news while I was standing at the kitchen counter, finishing dinner. The company had offered her a leadership role, overseeing several major projects, something she had been working toward for years. I remember feeling genuinely happy for her. I poured 2 glasses of wine, and we sat at the old wooden table while she explained the new responsibilities that would come with the position. Her voice carried the excitement of someone who had finally been recognized for years of effort. I listened carefully, asking questions, and imagining what this step might mean for her future. Later that week, a few of our neighbors stopped by with a small cake and a card. Word travels quickly in a small town, especially when someone receives good news. They congratulated Caroline warmly and joked that she might soon become the most important professional in the entire county. She laughed politely and accepted the compliments, though I noticed her shoulders straightening slightly each time someone praised her work. For the next few days, our house felt a little more lively than usual. Phone calls came in from friends and former co-workers, and Caroline repeated the story of the promotion several times with the careful pride of someone still getting used to hearing it aloud. At first, everything about it felt natural. Success often brings celebration, and celebration tends to bring conversation. I didn't think much about the small details of those conversations until a few weeks later. One evening after dinner, Caroline mentioned the size of her new salary while we were clearing the table. She said it casually, as if it were simply another piece of information about the job. The number was larger than anything either of us had earned before. I nodded and said something about how proud I was of the work she had put into reaching that point. It felt like the right response, and for a moment the conversation ended there. But the topic returned the following week. We were sitting in the living room while a light rain tapped softly against the windows. Caroline had been reviewing some financial documents on her laptop, and she mentioned again how dramatically her income had increased. She said that with the new role, she would now be responsible for a much larger portion of our household finances. Her tone was calm, almost thoughtful, but the sentence lingered in the air longer than I expected. I simply nodded and agreed that her promotion would certainly help our overall stability. At the time, I interpreted the comment as simple pride in her achievement. Anyone who works hard toward a goal deserves the chance to feel proud when it finally arrives. Still, the subject came up again. A few days later, while we were discussing whether the roof might need repairs before winter, Caroline said that with her salary increase, she might end up covering most of the larger expenses around the house from now on. She didn't say it in a harsh way. In fact, she sounded almost practical, like someone thinking out loud about new responsibilities. I remember pausing for a moment before responding. For years, we had managed our finances together in a quiet, unspoken way. Bills were paid, repairs were handled, and life moved forward without either of us needing to keep a running list of who had done what. But now, the conversation had shifted slightly. The comments about income began appearing in small, almost casual remarks. Sometimes it happened while we were reviewing monthly expenses, and other times it slipped into conversations that had nothing to do with money at all. At first, I brushed those remarks aside. I told myself that Caroline was simply adjusting to a new position and the pressure that came with it. Promotions often change how people think about responsibility, and I assumed the moment would pass once the excitement settled. Still, something in her tone began to feel different. There was a distance in it, a subtle shift in the way she described our shared life. The words themselves were polite, but they carried a quiet emphasis on what she was now providing. One evening, we sat together on the couch, while a news program played softly in the background. Caroline was answering a message on her phone when she mentioned almost absent-mindedly that her new role meant she would probably be carrying the financial weight of our household for the foreseeable future. The sentence was spoken so calmly that it might have passed unnoticed. But that night I found myself thinking about it long after the television had been turned off and the house had gone quiet. I wasn't angry. I was simply aware, perhaps for the first time, that the language of our life together had begun to change in ways I didn't yet understand. The moment everything became clear did not arrive during an argument. It came on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that usually disappears from memory. I was standing in the kitchen rinsing the last plate from dinner, while the window above the sink reflected the soft yellow light from the ceiling fixture. Outside, the street was already quiet, and the faint sound of a passing car drifted through the open window. Caroline walked in from the living room carrying her laptop and a folder of papers. She set them down on the table in a way that suggested she had something specific in mind. For a moment she watched me finish washing the dishes. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, folding her hands together on the table, as if preparing for a conversation she had already rehearsed. Her voice when she spoke was calm. She said that we needed to talk about our finances. I dried my hands with a dish towel and sat across from her. There was nothing in her tone that suggested anger, but there was a firmness there that caught my attention. She opened the folder and slid a few printed documents across the table. They looked like simple financial summaries, the kind you might print when reviewing a budget or planning future expenses. Caroline explained that her new position had changed the way she thought about money. With the increase in her salary, she said the financial structure of our household no longer made as much sense as it once had. At first, I assumed she meant we should adjust the way we managed certain bills. But then she said something that made me pause. She said that perhaps it was time for us to separate our finances completely. The words were delivered gently, almost professionally. She explained that if each of us handled our own money, it would make things clearer and more fair going forward. I sat there quietly for a moment while she continued talking. She spoke about independence and responsibility, about how modern couples sometimes benefit from maintaining separate financial identities. None of it sounded unreasonable on the surface. Still, there was something about the direction of the conversation that felt unfamiliar. I asked her what had brought this idea on so suddenly. Caroline leaned back slightly in her chair and exhaled. For a brief moment, she seemed to search for the right words. Then, she said something that changed the entire tone of the evening. She said that lately, she had started to feel as though she was carrying most of the financial responsibility for our life together. The sentence landed in the quiet kitchen like a small stone dropped into still water. I looked at her carefully, wondering if I had misunderstood what she meant. Caroline continued speaking, her tone still calm, but now more direct. She said that with her promotion, the difference between our incomes had grown so large that our financial arrangement no longer felt balanced to her. Then, she used a word that I had not expected to hear from the woman I had spent so many years beside. She said that sometimes it felt as though she was supporting someone who had quietly become dependent on her success. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse me of anything directly. But the meaning of the sentence was clear enough. In her mind, I had begun to resemble a weight she was carrying, rather than a partner standing beside her. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. I remember looking down at my hands resting on the table. They were the same hands that had spent years repairing broken hinges, patching small leaks, and tightening the bolts on the old fence that ran along the back of our property. Those hands had built shelves in the garage, replaced the kitchen faucet twice, and installed the small garden boxes that Caroline had once said made the backyard feel more welcoming. None of those thoughts arrived with anger. They arrived more like quiet memories drifting through my mind as I tried to understand what had just been said. Caroline kept talking. She explained that separating our finances would simply reflect the reality of our current situation. Each of us would manage our own income. Household expenses could be divided evenly. She described the idea with the same tone she might use during a meeting at work. Practical, organized, efficient. I listened carefully to every word. Part of me wondered if she realized how the conversation sounded. For decades, we had moved through life together, without measuring who had contributed more. The house had been maintained, the bills had been paid, and the quiet details of everyday life had been handled without ceremony. But now, those details seemed to have faded into the background. What remained in her view was a simple calculation. Income on one side, responsibility on the other. And somewhere in that equation, my place had shifted. I raised my eyes and looked across the table at her. Caroline's expression was not cruel. If anything, she looked almost relieved to finally be saying the things she had been thinking. That realization was perhaps the most surprising part of the evening. She did not see this conversation as an attack. To her, it was simply a correction, a practical adjustment to a life that had changed. But sitting there in that quiet kitchen, I felt something settle slowly in my chest. Not anger, not resentment. Just the quiet understanding that somewhere along the way, the years of quiet support I had offered had become invisible. And once something becomes invisible long enough, people eventually forget it was ever there. I remember that moment in the kitchen very clearly. The words Caroline had spoken were still hanging quietly in the air, yet the house itself felt unchanged. The refrigerator hummed softly, and somewhere outside, a dog barked once before the street returned to silence. What surprised me most about that evening was my own reaction. I did not argue with her. I did not defend myself or begin listing the things I had done over the years. Instead, I sat there for a moment, folded the dish towel neatly on the counter, and told her that if separating our finances was what she believed would make things fair, then I was willing to try it. Caroline looked genuinely surprised. For a brief moment she blinked, as if she had expected resistance or at least a long discussion. When none came, her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded with a quiet sense of confirmation. She said she thought it would help us both understand our responsibilities more clearly. I simply nodded. If there was anything I had learned over the years, it was that some conversations reveal more when they are allowed to unfold without interruption. Within a few days, we opened separate accounts. Caroline handled the paperwork quickly, the same way she approached most things connected to her work. She spoke about clarity and independence as though we were implementing a well-organized project, rather than adjusting the foundation of our marriage. We agreed that household expenses would be split evenly. Utilities, groceries, repairs, and anything connected to the house would be recorded and divided between us. Caroline suggested that we track everything in a shared spreadsheet, so there would be no confusion about who paid for what. I told her that sounded reasonable. That same evening, she created the file on her laptop while we sat at the dining table. The columns were simple: date, item, amount, and who had paid for it. Caroline explained how we would update it every week. The system, she said, would make everything transparent. I remember looking at the screen for a moment before closing the laptop gently. Transparency, I thought, is an interesting word. The following days passed quietly. Outwardly, nothing dramatic changed. We still lived in the same house, walked through the same rooms, and followed many of the same routines that had shaped our lives for years. Yet something about the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was difficult to describe. Caroline seemed more confident than before. Her new role at work had clearly given her a sense of momentum, and she moved through the house with the quiet certainty of someone who believed she had finally corrected an imbalance. I, on the other hand, began paying attention. Not in a suspicious way, but in a thoughtful one. For years, I had handled many of the small responsibilities that kept our home running smoothly. Fixing things when they broke, scheduling maintenance, paying certain bills before they became urgent. Those tasks had rarely required discussion. Now, with the new system in place, I watched more carefully how those responsibilities appeared on the spreadsheet. Some things were obvious. Groceries were easy to track. So were electricity and internet bills. But there were other costs that did not appear as neatly in a weekly entry. Repairs that happened quietly before a problem grew larger. Maintenance expenses that had been paid from my personal savings without much thought. For the first time in years, I began reviewing the records I had kept in an old filing cabinet in the garage. It was something I had organized long ago out of habit. Inside the drawer were folders labeled with simple notes: insurance repairs, maintenance, home improvements. Most of the documents were routine receipts and invoices that I had never considered particularly important. But one evening, while Caroline was in the office on another late conference call, I decided to sit down at the dining table and go through them. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of her voice drifting down the hallway. I opened the first folder and began flipping through the papers slowly. At first, it felt like a simple walk through old memories. There was the receipt from the year we replaced the water heater after it failed in the middle of winter. Another from when the roof had been repaired after a storm damaged several shingles. Each document carried a small reminder of a problem that had once needed solving. But as I continued turning the pages, something began to stand out. Many of those payments had not come from our joint household account. They had come from my personal savings. I paused and looked more carefully. The heating system replacement alone had cost several $1,000s. The roof repair had been another large expense. There were smaller costs as well. Plumbing work, electrical updates, the installation of a new garage door, when the old one finally gave out after years of use. Individually, none of those decisions had seemed significant at the time. They were simply things that needed to be done. But sitting there at the table with the paperwork spread out before me, I began adding the numbers together in my head. The total surprised even me. Over the years, I had quietly covered a substantial portion of the home's long-term maintenance without ever mentioning it to Caroline. Not because I was hiding it, simply because I had never believed it needed explaining. Marriage in my mind had always meant stepping forward when something needed attention. Yet now, in the new world defined by spreadsheets and financial separation, those quiet decisions carried a different meaning. I leaned back in the chair and looked toward the hallway where Caroline's voice still echoed softly from her call. For the first time since that conversation in the kitchen, a different realization settled into my mind. The story of our finances was not as simple as either of us had assumed. And sometimes the truth about a relationship does not appear in arguments or accusations. Sometimes it reveals itself quietly in the forgotten pages of old receipts and the quiet understanding that follows. For the first few days after we separated our finances, life inside the house looked almost exactly the same. We still moved through the same routines. The coffee brewed in the morning, the lights clicked on in the hallway after sunset, and the quiet rhythm of our home continued without any obvious disruption. But something inside me had changed. For the first time in many years, I decided to step back from the small responsibilities I had always taken care of automatically, not out of resentment, simply because the system we had agreed upon required clarity. If we were now dividing life according to financial responsibility, then it seemed fair that the daily work behind that life should follow the same principle. The first difference appeared in the kitchen. For years, I had been the one who quietly checked the pantry before grocery day. I kept a small list in the drawer near the refrigerator, adding items whenever something ran low. Milk, coffee filters, cleaning supplies. That week, I did not write anything on the list. I waited. A few days later, Caroline opened the refrigerator and paused. We were nearly out of several things that normally appeared in the house without much discussion. She stood there for a moment, studying the shelves before asking if we needed groceries. I told her calmly that I had not checked. She nodded, grabbed her keys, and left for the store. It was a small moment, but it marked the beginning of a different pattern. Over the following weeks, I continued adjusting the way I handled daily responsibilities. I no longer scheduled routine maintenance for the house, unless it directly involved something under my name. When a light fixture in the hallway began flickering, I mentioned it to Caroline, but did not immediately reach for my toolbox the way I normally would. She looked at it for a moment and said she would call an electrician. Another change appeared in the weekly bills. Since we now tracked everything through the shared spreadsheet, I simply entered the expenses I personally handled and left the rest for Caroline to review. The system she had created worked exactly the way she intended. Every purchase appeared neatly in its own row. Groceries, utilities, repairs. At first, Caroline seemed pleased with the arrangement. She updated the document regularly, sometimes even adjusting the formatting to make it easier to read. The structure gave her a sense of control that she appreciated. But gradually, the quiet complexity of daily life began revealing itself. One Saturday morning, she spent nearly 2 hours calling different service companies to schedule a routine inspection for the heating system. The previous year, I had arranged that appointment automatically without mentioning it. This time, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone and a notebook writing down prices and available time slots. I watched from across the room while reading the newspaper. When she finally finished, she leaned back in the chair and sighed. It was not frustration exactly. More like the realization that certain tasks required more attention than they first appeared to. The grocery trips changed as well. Caroline had always shopped occasionally, but now she was responsible for planning the full weekly list. One evening, She returned home with several bags and began unpacking them across the counter. Some items were missing. Others had been purchased twice. She noticed the mistake while organizing the cabinets and laughed softly at herself. "I guess there's more to it than just walking through the store," she said. I nodded and continued washing a plate in the sink. None of these moments were dramatic. They were simply the natural result of a system we had agreed to. For years, many of those details had existed quietly in the background of our lives. Now, they were visible in a way they had never been before. Caroline began spending more time thinking about the house itself, the maintenance schedule, the insurance renewals, the timing of seasonal repairs. One evening, she asked if the gutters had been cleaned recently. I told her I believed it had been done the previous autumn. She made a note on her phone to check with a local service company. Another week passed, then another. Little by little, the structure of our household began shifting. Nothing collapsed. Nothing dramatic happened. But the invisible framework that once supported our daily life was now visible in small pieces, scattered across the calendar, the spreadsheet, and the quiet conversations that filled our evenings. Caroline never complained. In fact, she handled each responsibility with the same determination she brought to her work. But I noticed the difference in the way she moved through the house. There was a new awareness in her expressions when she opened a bill, scheduled a repair, or updated the spreadsheet late at night. The work that had once been silent had finally stepped into the light. And sometimes the simple act of seeing something clearly changes the way people understand the life they are living. The changes inside our home did not happen all at once. They appeared slowly, almost the way seasons shift without anyone noticing the exact day it begins. At first, Caroline approached the new system with the same confidence she carried into her office each morning. She updated the spreadsheet regularly and spoke about our finances with a sense of clarity that seemed to reassure her. But daily life has a way of revealing its hidden layers over time. One evening, she sat at the dining table reviewing a list of upcoming expenses. The heating inspection had revealed a small issue with one of the valves, and the technician recommended replacing it before winter arrived. Caroline looked at the estimate for a long moment. In the past, that kind of decision would have been handled quietly. I would have called the technician back the next day and scheduled the work. Now, the decision sat in front of her like a small puzzle waiting to be solved. She asked a few questions about the system and the previous maintenance records. I answered what I could, but most of the details were buried in old receipts and notes from repairs done years earlier. That was when I first noticed the subtle change in her expression. It wasn't frustration. It was awareness. The following weeks brought more of the same small discoveries. A plumbing issue in the guest bathroom required 3 different phone calls before an appointment could be scheduled. The insurance renewal arrived in the mail with several pages of updates that needed careful reading. Each task was manageable on its own, but together, they formed a quiet pattern of responsibilities that had once blended seamlessly into the background of our lives. One evening, Caroline sat across from me at the kitchen table, while the spreadsheet was open on her laptop. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. She scrolled through the rows, slowly reviewing the entries from the past month. Groceries, utilities, repair estimates, maintenance costs. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she closed the laptop and rested her hands on the table. "I didn't realize how many small things there were," she said softly. Her voice carried no defensiveness, just recognition. I nodded but did not interrupt. Sometimes people need the space to finish their own thoughts. Caroline looked toward the window for a moment before continuing. She said that when she received the promotion, everything at work had changed almost overnight. The expectations were higher, the deadlines shorter, and the responsibility for large projects now rested directly on her decisions. At the office, she felt as though every meeting required her to prove she deserved the position. She admitted that the pressure had been heavier than she expected. "I kept thinking that if I didn't stay completely in control of everything, someone would eventually realize they had made a mistake promoting me," she said. Her words came slowly, as if she had not spoken them out loud before. She explained that focusing on money and financial responsibility had become a way to reassure herself that she was strong enough to handle the role. The promotion had given her success, but it had also brought a quiet fear that she might lose it. Listening to her speak, I began to understand something I had not considered before. The distance that had appeared between us had not been created entirely by arrogance or disregard. Some of it had grown from the pressure she carried each day. That realization did not erase the words she had spoken in the kitchen, but it gave them a context that made the situation feel more human. Caroline leaned back in her chair and sighed softly. "I thought I understood how our life worked," she said. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. The cabinets, the window, the small repairs that kept the house standing comfortably year after year. "I guess there were a lot of things happening that I never really saw." I looked at her for a moment before responding. The truth was simple. For many years, the quiet work behind our life together had been invisible because it had never demanded attention. Now that it had stepped into the open, it was impossible to ignore. And sometimes, understanding arrives not through arguments, but through the slow realization that the world we depend on has always been built by hands we never noticed. Several weeks passed after that conversation at the kitchen table. Nothing dramatic happened during that time. Life simply continued moving forward in the quiet way it usually does. But something inside our home had shifted. The changes were small at first, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. Caroline began asking questions about things she had never needed to think about before. Not questions out of frustration, but out of curiosity. One morning, she stood beside me in the kitchen while I was pouring coffee, and asked how often the water filter in the refrigerator needed replacing. Another afternoon, she asked where I kept the warranty papers for the appliances. The tone of her voice was different now. It was thoughtful. Over the years, I had learned that understanding rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly, the way morning light gradually fills a room. One quiet evening about a month later, Caroline came home earlier than usual. The sun was setting outside the living room window, and the house carried that warm stillness that arrives at the end of a long day. She walked into the kitchen holding something small in her hand. At first, I thought it was another stack of work papers, but when she set it on the table, I saw that it was a notebook. It was simple. Dark blue cover, the kind you might buy at any office supply store. Caroline sat down across from me and placed the notebook gently between us. "I started writing something," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a seriousness behind it. I pulled the notebook a little closer and opened the first page. Inside were rows of neat handwriting. The pages listed tasks that had slowly appeared in her life over the past several weeks. Scheduling maintenance appointments, tracking utility bills, managing insurance updates, calling repair services, planning grocery lists. Dozens of small responsibilities that had once existed quietly in the background of our home. Caroline watched my expression while I turned the pages. "This is everything I noticed in just 1 month," she said. I flipped through the notebook slowly. Some pages included short notes beside the tasks, little reminders about when something needed attention, or which service company had been the most reliable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Then, Caroline reached forward and turned the notebook back to the first page. She had written something there in larger letters than the rest of the list. I read the sentence silently. "The work you don't see is still real work." I looked up at her. There was no defensiveness in her expression, only honesty. Caroline rested her hands on the table and took a slow breath. "I didn't understand," before she said. Her words were not rushed. They arrived carefully, as if she wanted to be sure each one was clear. When I started handling everything myself, I realized how much of our life had always been moving quietly behind the scenes. She glanced at the notebook again. "All those little things add up," she continued. "More than I ever realized." I listened without interrupting. After so many years together, I had learned that some conversations are more important when they unfold slowly. Caroline looked toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "I was so focused on proving myself at work that I started measuring everything by numbers," she said. "Salary, promotions, responsibility." Her eyes returned to mine, and somewhere along the way I forgot to look at the rest of our life. There was a long pause after that. Not an uncomfortable silence, just the kind that appears when two people are finally seeing the same thing clearly. Caroline pushed the notebook gently toward me. "I wanted you to have this," she said. I shook my head slightly. "You wrote it," I told her. She smiled softly. "No," she said. "I wrote it because of you." For a moment, I simply sat there looking at the notebook. It wasn't an apology written in dramatic words. It was something quieter. Recognition. Respect. After a lifetime of small, unnoticed efforts, that recognition carried more weight than any argument ever could. Later that evening, we sat together on the back porch, while the last light faded from the sky. The air was cool and calm, and the garden behind the house rustled softly in the breeze. Caroline spoke about adjusting her schedule, so work would not consume every evening the way it had during the first weeks of her promotion. We talked about sharing certain responsibilities more openly, so neither of us would ever feel invisible again. Nothing in that conversation felt forced. It felt like two people rediscovering the balance they had once assumed would always exist. As the sky darkened, Caroline reached over and squeezed my hand gently. It was a simple gesture, but sometimes the smallest gestures carry the clearest meaning. At 66 years old, I have learned something important about dignity. It does not come from winning arguments. It comes from knowing your own value and having the patience to let the truth reveal itself. The boundaries we set that year did not break our marriage. They clarified it. They reminded both of us that respect is not measured only in money or titles. It is measured in the quiet work people do for one another every single day. And sometimes, when that work is finally seen, something inside a relationship becomes stronger than it was before. That notebook still sits on the shelf beside my desk. I do not open it very often. I don't need to, because the message written on its first page is something I carry with me now wherever I go. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to a chapter of my life. I've learned that dignity often begins with a simple boundary calmly held. If this story reminds you of your own experience, I'd be grateful if you shared it in the comments. This story uses recreated characters and events for storytelling and reflection.